establishing central control immediately, preparing to develop pieces harmoniously. Developing the knight to f6 offers immediate central influence and prepares for kingside castling. Immediately pins the knight, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain central influence. Knight finds a new outpost, eyeing white's queen and creating central disruption. Relinquishing the bishop's prime diagonal invites doubled pawns for positional pressure. Immediately contesting the center with c5 offers a dynamic pawn structure and challenges white's early initiative. Aggressively challenging black's cavalry disrupts their coordination and aims to seize central space. Disrupting white's pawn structure, black forces a response that opens lines and demands precise calculation. Challenging black's aggressive queen sortie, white fortifies the queenside pawn structure, preparing to anchor the king's defense. Recapturing the knight subtly concedes central influence, opting for peace preservation over immediate initiative. Developing the knight to d2 aims to bolster the central pawn structure while preparing for queenside expansion. Sacrificing pawn tempo to disrupt white's central pawns opens lines, but be wary of white's developing lead. Reclaiming central space, this knight aims to challenge black's queen's mobility and bolster the pawn chain's integrity. Shifting queen to a more active diagonal creates immediate pressure and threatens to exploit the weakened queenside structure. Reclaiming the center pawn opens a diagonal for the queen and prepares kingside development, but it grants black improved central influence and activity. Recentralizing the knight after a temporary foray to the queenside aims to contest white's central control. Deciding to simplify, white exchanges queens, aiming to leverage a slight pawn majority in the upcoming middle game. Opening the file offers counterplay and exposes the white king's defenses. Developing the bishop to a central square, eyeing the weakened queenside pawn structure, prepares for a potential queenside expansion. Opening the center dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating dynamic possibilities and potential weak squares. Capturing that pawn dramatically simplifies the position, opening up the file for future pressure. Seizing central space with the pawn, black aggressively challenges white's bishop and opens up attacking avenues for the queenside pawns. Opening a central dynamic to potentially unravel black's pawn structure. Developing the bishop now opens lines and prepares to contest the center, but the king's diagonal faces potential exposure. Asserting dominance on the queenside, this bishop aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and restrict its mobility. This knight immediately seeks to reinforce the central d5 pawn and potentially launch a kingside assault. Anchoring the bishop on the bishop's diagonal secures the queenside and eyes potential weaknesses. Opening the queenside and creating a pawn majority offers black dynamic play. Repositioning the knight to c1 aims to escape the pin and potentially reroute to a more active square, though it sacrifices immediate central influence. Now that the d4 pawn is removed, black opens a critical central file, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination and potentially activate the rook. Opening the b file with this recapture grants access for your rook to a crucial open file, hinting at future offensive potential. Asserting control of the central d file now becomes a race to see who can consolidate their pieces most effectively. Initiating piece coordination, this knight prepares to support pawn advances while eyeing central control. Relocating the monarch to d7 will prevent it from becoming a target in the open center. Introducing a knight to the central fray to contest key squares and potentially launch an attack on the queenside. Exchanging that bishop significantly loosens white's kingside pawn structure. Securing the king amidst a fractured pawn structure acknowledges the immediate tactical realities of the position. Activating the rook on the third rank begins a coordinated assault, aiming to exploit white's weakened queenside structure. Activating the rook on the d-file shores up control and prepares for potential pawn advances or rook invasions. Asserting pressure along the open, a file demands immediate attention, aiming to dislodge the entrenched knight and create attacking avenues. Solidifying the d-file is paramount, eyeing a potential rook lift to reignite the kingside attack. Solidifying your pawn structure in anticipation of potentially liberating the queenside and improving king's safety. Reclaiming the central file becomes paramount, setting the stage for potential piece activity. Grabbing the pawn, black dives into a tactical labyrinth, hoping to unravel white's queenside pawn structure. Simplifying the material, white aims to capitalize on the open files for rook activity. Suddenly, black gains a dangerous passed pawn on the queenside, opening new avenues for attack. The rook now aggressively claims the open file, forcing a critical decision on black regarding piece deployment. Securing a foothold for the knight offers crucial support to the queenside pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop aims to dismantle black's pawn structure and open lines for attack. Reclaiming that pawn opens a vital file for your rook, potentially pressuring white's king. Asserting control over the open b-file and threatening the stranded knight. Reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for a kingside pawn storm is a sound positional idea. Initiating a forced exchange that simplifies the position and targets black's isolated pawns. Seeking to consolidate a precarious central presence, the black monarch ventures forth, aiming to shield its pawn chain and potentially engage in the endgame. Confronting the passed pawn's threat, this captures the bishop, forcing a favorable endgame with clear material dominance for white. The knight's return to its original square signifies a desperate attempt to shore up the queenside pawn structure. Unlocking the knight's potential now aims to control the central open files. The king ventures forward, seeking activity in this simplified endgame, but leaves its own ranks exposed. The monarch ventures toward the center, aiming to bolster its weakened pawns and secure a more active role in the proceedings. Reasserting control of the open file, the knight repositions to a more active square, ready to challenge white's weakened pawn structure. Unleashing a discovered check, white forces the black king into a cramped corner, aiming to exploit the exposed royal. The black king embarks on an adventurous sortie, venturing deep into enemy territory. A calculated gamble to centralize the monarch, hoping to exploit the open lines and potentially outmaneuver black's beleaguered king. Gaining central control is paramount now, but this piece's placement feels a tad aimless. A bold repositioning, aiming to dominate the central files and exploit black's undeveloped queenside pieces. Exposing your monarch further on the kingside is a risky endeavor given the open board. Restoring the knight to its starting square after a positional detour, anticipating a future kingside pawn push. A last hurrah for the knight, forcing the white king to a precarious, exposed position. The king's march to the center signals a desperate attempt to activate a dormant piece, though it risks exposure in the process. Shifting the knight to a5 initiates a fascinating positional dance, aiming to exploit weaknesses in white's queenside structure. Reasserting central control, this knight targets key squares and pressures black's isolated pawns. Forcing white's king to a less secure square, this check aims to disrupt their defensive structure and improve black's piece activity. The monarch sidesteps the perpetual chase, seeking refuge on the king row. A desperate attempt to revive this rook pawn by checking the king, but white's response will be straightforward. The king's retreat to d2 initiates a desperate attempt to escape the immediate check, but it also exposes it further. Excellent, the knight's fork is a crucial moment, forcing the white king to a passive square. The king's escape to the queenside is a risky endeavor, inviting further checks and potentially trapping the monarch. A bold foray into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create immediate tactical possibilities. Sensing an opening, the knight eyes the vulnerable pawn chain, a subtle shift in control. Unleashing the bishop on the long diagonal demands careful attention to that unprotected knight. King maneuver finally finds purchase, aiming to disrupt black's knight outpost and exploit the weakened c-file. Stepping the king back to c6, solidifies its central presence, and prepares to potentially support a pawn advance or defend against further knight incursions. Relocating the monarch to safer territory becomes paramount as the opposing knight probes vulnerable squares. Repositioning the bishop to a6 prepares for a potential advance of the knight to c4, adding pressure to white's central pawns. Securing the king's path and preparing for the rook's activity are the priorities. Unleashing the knight's potential on the queen side opens up surprising infiltration routes. Reinforcing the d-pawn allows white to potentially create passed pawns later, influencing the endgame geometry. A tactical foray into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt the knight's current positional advantage and potentially open lines. Securing the central squares with the king is paramount to prevent further incursions by black's pieces. Preparing to expand on the king side, creating potential attacking avenues and space for future piece maneuvering. Preparing to anchor the knight with a pawn push, aiming to restrict the bishop's diagonal influence. A final desperate gamble. This knight's sortie aims to disrupt white's consolidation and hunt for any weakness before white's central pawns advance. The king's exposed position now becomes a serious concern, demanding careful maneuvering. A desperate pawn thrust seeking to dislodge the entrenched knight and open lines for desperate counterplay. The knight vacates the central outpost, preparing to redeploy and contest the bishop's diagonal control. Shifting the king away from the dangerous kingside offers a breath of fresh air, seeking safer squares on the queen side. Bringing the knight to a more active outpost promises better piece coordination. Unleashing the knight to g1 reestablishes a much-needed defensive screen for the monarch. Securing the central pawn advance with the knight's repositioning offers black a critical central outpost. Unleashing a pawn's potential, this advance aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and create breathing room for black's forces. Shifting the king towards the center offers more defensive options as the pawns advance. Consolidating forces seems paramount. The king is exposed and needs protection. Awaiting a more precise definition of that knight's purpose. Currently, it's just pacing on the edge of the action. Igniting central action by kicking the knight creates immediate tension and forces white to react. Exposing the e-pawn offers a tantalizing opportunity to unlock black's passed pawn and disrupt white's already precarious kingside. Seizing control of the central squares with the bishop, black initiates a potential counterattack and prepares to consolidate their material advantage. Reclaiming the outpost with the knight offers white a chance to coordinate piece activity and challenge black's advanced pawn structure. Repositioning the bishop to g8 frees the pawn chain for a potential breakthrough, aiming to disrupt white's centralized king. Challenging black's king safety and forcing an awkward pawn structure is the immediate goal here. King's vulnerable positioning on the edge invites further complications. Securing the knight's outpost on g5 finally disrupts black's aggressive pawn storm. Pushing the king forward into the enemy half invites immediate danger, sacrificing essential defensive pawn cover. Reinforcing the pawn chain, though it invites further piece pressure.